My livestock were wasting away from thirst. The homeowners association refused to let me dig a well on my own property, saying it would damage the environment. Just one well, that's all I asked for, to keep my animals alive. But they turned me down. Then, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run hot. What I saw just beyond my fence line was so outrageously hypocritical. Everything suddenly made sense. They had barred me from tapping into the groundwater, but they underestimated what I'd do when pushed too far. This wasn't just about cattle anymore, this was about exposing lies, and showing what happens when someone picks a fight with the wrong farmer. The day I laid my father to rest, I made him a vow, one that would eventually unravel the life of a corrupt government official. Standing in that windswept cemetery, gazing at the rich wood of his coffin, I could almost hear his voice in my head. He'd said it from his hospital bed, just a few days before he passed, gripping my hand with surprising strength for a man so close to death. "Promise me you'll make this land green again, son." That voice haunted me. This ranch at the Vance family land had been ours since 1923, when my great-grandfather bought 200 acres of rich Texas soil for next to nothing. Back then, the springs ran clear and the rain came just in time. The grass was thick, the cattle were healthy, and life was good. Now, after 3 brutal years of record-breaking drought, my inheritance resembled a barren wasteland more than a working ranch. My herd was shrinking. 50 head of cattle were becoming thinner by the day. I could see their ribs. They moved slower, their eyes dull with fatigue. I had already buried 2 of my best breeders, both lost to dehydration. I watched helplessly as they collapsed onto land their ancestors once grazed on, back when the fields were emerald green. Each day, I made the same painful walk to check on the rest of the herd. And every time, my heart sank a little more. My wife, Sarah, we've been married 15 years, had started giving me those quiet, anxious looks. I knew what she was thinking. How long could we hang on before we'd have to give up and move into town? Our vet bills were climbing fast. Feed had to be hauled in from other states, and it wasn't cheap. And the emotional weight watching our family's heritage slowly crumble was becoming unbearable. Then Ruby arrived, my 12-year-old niece, coming to spend her summer break with us. She brought with her the kind of bold curiosity that adults seem to lose somewhere along the way. Obsessed with filming everything on her phone, Ruby had a sharp eye for detail, something that would soon prove invaluable. She filmed it all: the sunrises over our dying land, the cattle milling around empty water troughs, even me shaking my fists at the empty sky in frustration. One morning, while I was inspecting a broken fence post, she said, "Uncle Marcus, this would make an awesome documentary on climate change and farming." I didn't say much, just kept hammering. But she was right, and the contrast between what this land once was and what it had become told a powerful story. To anyone with common sense, the answer was obvious. Dig a well and tap into the groundwater that had fed this land for generations. I had spent weeks researching water rights and the rules for well drilling, night after night at the kitchen table, poring over regulations until my eyes blurred. Everything I found pointed to the same thing: as a landowner in the agricultural crisis, it should have been a clear path. Our family had been tending this soil for nearly 100 years. The process should have been simple, the fees steep, but manageable. I had the funds set aside to bring in a professional drilling crew, so I decided to head into town and apply. The housing authority building felt as sterile as a hospital, the kind of place that smelled of bleach and disappointment. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the linoleum squeaked under every step. A weary-looking receptionist directed me to the office of Victoria Thornfield. She warned me to keep it short. Said Victoria didn't like to be kept waiting. Victoria was in her mid-50s, cold eyes, the kind of woman who sized you up in one glance and dismissed you just as quickly. She wore a navy blue suit that looked like it came with its own security detail, and jewelry that sparkled with every gesture. Her walls were covered in plaques and certificates about environmental responsibility and water use, like she was some kind of authority on the very problem I was trying to solve. She greeted me with a rehearsed smile that didn't reach her eyes. When she extended her hand, it felt like shaking a mannequin's. "Mr. Vance," she said, like she was speaking to someone beneath her, I understand you're interested in applying for a well permit on your ranch. I explained everything at the dying cattle, the legacy, the promise I made to my father as he lay dying. She barely blinked. Her face didn't change. She had the detached expression of someone who's heard too many sad stories and stopped caring a long time ago. Then, without a word of sympathy, she slid a thick stack of paperwork across her polished desk. 47 pages. She informed me the application fee was $2,000, not to get the well approved, not to pay for inspections or services, just to have someone look at my forms and decide if I was allowed to access the water that lay beneath my own soil. Something about that hit me hard. Day like having to pay rent to sleep in your own house. But I was out of options, and I was desperate enough to pay whatever it took to keep my cattle and my father's promise alive. To honor my father's memory, I completed the entire application with painstaking care. I answered every question in full, included every detail they asked for, and even paid for extra testing, soil reports and environmental assessments that ran me another $1,500. Victoria went over every document with the precision of a forensic auditor. She asked sharp, calculated questions about my projected water usage and scribbled mysterious notes in the margins that I couldn't make out from across her polished desk. The whole process felt more like an elaborate trap than an application, a maze of red tape clearly designed to wear you down until you gave up. When I finally submitted the completed packet, she gave me a mechanical nod. "We'll review this thoroughly," she said, her voice making it clear she thought my concerns about livestock were a waste of her time. Then the letter came, thick envelope, official seal from the housing authority stamped in the corner, my name printed on the front like it had been spit out of a machine, impersonal and cold. I stood there holding it in the kitchen, my heart pounding like it already knew the answer. Sarah was at the sink humming softly to the tune on the radio. Ruby sat nearby, headphones on, completely absorbed in editing her latest video. It was one of those quiet, ordinary moments that felt too fragile to interrupt. But I opened it anyway. The first thing I saw was a bold red stamp, "Denied," smeared across the top like a cruel joke. The rest was bureaucratic doublespeak. 3 paragraphs of exaggerated nonsense about irreversible damage to endangered ecosystems and critical groundwater reserves essential for local wildlife. It read more like a doomsday report than a denial for a single water well. I read that letter 3 times before it really hit me, and each time, my anger grew. Endangered ecosystem? Critical reserves? Regional preservation? I'd spent my life on that land. I knew every corner of it better than I knew my own living room. There was no delicate ecosystem, no fragile wildlife sanctuary, just sun-scorched earth, dying grass, and cattle clinging to life. Whatever fantasy Victoria was describing in that letter, it didn't exist on my land. So I did what anyone in my position would have done. I jumped in my truck and drove every acre of my property, determined to find whatever it was she claimed I was putting at risk. All I saw was what I already knew was there. Brittle tumbleweed scraping across dust, cracked soil under my boots, a rattlesnake hole by the old barn, rusted car parts from decades past, and an abandoned tire someone dumped years ago. No protected species in sight unless you counted the occasional roadrunner darting through the mesquite. No wetlands, no rare plants, no hidden sanctuary, just the dry, battered land I'd been fighting to save. Victoria's version of my property wasn't just inaccurate, it was fiction, plain and simple. The disconnect between what was real and what she claimed was so absurd. It made me question whether she was simply misinformed, a broken bar, or outright dishonest. That's when I decided to confront her directly. I picked up the phone and called her office. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my tone calm even though my blood was boiling, "I've gone through your decision line by line, and I'm struggling to understand what specific ecosystem you're referring to. I've walked every part of my property more times than I can count. Nothing matches the description in your letter." There was a long pause on the other end, so long, I wondered if she just hung up, but I could hear papers rustling faintly and whispers in the background. When she finally responded, her tone was different, and no more polite mask, no more carefully worded corporate charm. What came through the line next was cold and sharp, like steel stripped of its coating. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice like ice. "I would advise you not to question our environmental assessments. These evaluations are conducted by trained experts who understand complex ecological systems far beyond your level of experience. If you continue to dispute this decision or challenge the authority of this office, you may be placing yourself in a very difficult position. Legal consequences." That's what she said, as if asking questions about my own property, or seeking clarity on a government decision that directly affected my family's livelihood, was some sort of criminal offense. The threat wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet and deliberate, laced with just enough venom to leave a mark. I hung up the phone, stunned. I'd called looking for answers from someone who was supposed to serve the public, and instead, I felt like I'd just been blindsided by someone hiding behind a badge of authority. I sat in the kitchen afterward, staring through the window at my wilting pastures and weakening cattle. But as the initial shock wore off, something else started gnawing at me, something I hadn't fully considered until that moment. Victoria's life didn't match her paycheck. She drove a shiny new BMW that looked like it belonged in a luxury showroom, not parked in the dusty lot of a rural county office. And her house, perched on the only hill overlooking our little town, wasn't just big, it was extravagant. Wide porches, manicured grounds, sprawling architecture straight out of a glossy lifestyle magazine. She was, supposedly, just a mid-level public employee with a salary that barely cleared 60 grand a year. So how was she living like a millionaire? Where was all that extra money coming from? And then I remembered the conversations, quick comments from other farmers at the feed store and the diner, folks who'd also been denied well permits by Victoria, always under the same vague reasoning: environmental concerns. It was beginning to look less like isolated misfortune and more like a pattern, one that pointed to something far more deliberate than mere red tape. And that's when Ruby made the discovery that started unraveling the whole operation. She'd been out in the yard with her phone again, documenting her summer at the ranch like she always did. She wandered over to the fence line separating our dry property from the enormous ranch next door, a land that had always seemed oddly untouched by the drought. "Uncle Marcus," she called out, racing toward me with wide eyes and breathless urgency, "why does that lady from the government have so many cows? And why do they look so broken bar healthy?" I followed her finger, and what I saw nearly stopped my heart. Just beyond the fence was a rolling sea of green and a kind of lush, vibrant grass I hadn't seen in years. Grazing contentedly across that perfect pasture were hundreds of fat, healthy cattle, not just surviving, but thriving. Jet black Angus cows with glossy coats and sharp, alert eyes, at the very picture of health. And there, gleaming beside the main house like a badge of arrogance, was Victoria's unmistakable BMW, complete with personalized government plates. That night, I didn't sleep, but for the first time in a long while. It wasn't worry about the ranch or the finances that kept me awake, it was fury. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, digging into federal laws on water theft. I had a gut feeling that what Ruby stumbled upon was just the tip of a much darker scheme, and what I uncovered sent chills down my spine. Stealing municipal water for personal use, especially if you're a public official, isn't just a violation, it's a federal crime. Not a slap on the wrist fine, not a warning letter, a felony, one that carries up to 15 years in prison. There were precedents, real cases, harsh penalties. The law does not look kindly on public servants who exploit their positions for personal gain while denying resources to the very people they're meant to protect. But I couldn't do anything without the hard evidence. I needed to know exactly how Victoria was pulling this off, and just how deep it went. That's when Ruby, all 12 years and pure determination, looked me in the eye and said she wanted in. "Uncle Marcus," she told me the next morning, while Sarah silently poured coffee and pretended not to be listening, "I'm really good at finding stuff online. I know how to check databases and search public records. Let me help." I was hesitant. This was serious. But Ruby had that Van streak, had the same stubborn resolve that had kept this family on the land for generations. And truth be told, I needed all the help I could get, so we dove in together. For hours we sifted through county files, permits, land use applications, and obscure public records. We combed through anything that might explain how Victoria had access to more water than anyone else around, in the middle of the worst drought on record. What we found next was both eye-opening and infuriating. It painted a picture far bigger and far dirtier than we ever expected. What we uncovered wasn't just mismanagement or bias, it was a deeply rooted system of corruption that went far beyond environmental red tape or misguided policies. Victoria had dotted every I and crossed every T when it came to the legal documents for her ranch. She'd filed all the right permits, building permits for her palatial home, septic permits for waste systems, livestock licenses for her booming cattle operation, even paperwork for decorative landscaping that included multiple fountains and an immaculate garden. But the one thing we couldn't find after combing through every public record available was a single permit related to water. No water rights, no irrigation approvals, no authorization for tapping into municipal reserves, nothing. And yet, it was clear as day, Victoria's property had a massive, continuous water supply. On paper, her operation shouldn't have been functioning at all, but in reality, 500 head of prime cattle were thriving like they were living in a land of eternal spring. Ruby suggested we begin surveillance to document exactly how this shadow system worked. As much as I didn't want to involve a kid in something this serious, the truth was, her age made her practically invisible. Adults don't question kids filming with phones. They just assume it's for a game, a dance video, or some harmless internet thing. So, with phones and notebooks in hand, Ruby and I started tracking everything. Every truck, every delivery, every piece of movement at Victoria's ranch. We recorded it all with the focus and precision of a federal investigation. What we found confirmed everything we suspected and more. Each day followed the same carefully choreographed pattern. Early in the morning, the first truck would arrive with a massive load, 8,000 gallons of municipal water, earmarked for emergencies only. A few hours later, another truck came with the same amount. Then another in the heat of the afternoon, and one more in the evening for overnight irrigation. That totaled 30,000 gallons per day, more than 200,000 gallons a week, enough water to supply an entire neighborhood, and during a declared drought emergency, no less. At drought pricing, that volume of water would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. Yet here it was, flowing freely into Victoria's ranch like it was business as usual. Ruby captured every truck on video. I snapped photos of license plates, company names, driver faces, anything that could be used as evidence later. We also documented the advanced infrastructure hidden beneath her property, a maze of buried pipes, automated valves, and control systems that allowed water to be routed throughout her ranch like a commercial irrigation network. It was surprisingly sophisticated, clearly not something slapped together overnight. This setup took time, planning, money, and coordination. This wasn't just a selfish indulgence. It was a well-oiled machine, a calculated operation designed to divert public water into private hands. But the part that made my stomach turn was what we found leading directly to her house. A separate pipeline, a concealed and well-maintained, fed a sprawling, Olympic-sized swimming pool, extravagant fountains, and ornamental gardens that looked like something out of a luxury resort. While ranchers across the county were watching their wells run dry, while families were rationing water and animals were dying under the sun, Victoria was living like water was her birthright, unlimited, unchecked, and stolen. At that point, I knew I needed to confront her, but not with rage. Not yet. A direct accusation would just push her into defense mode, maybe even give her time to erase the evidence we'd worked so hard to gather. So I came up with a plan. I'd approach her as a struggling rancher looking to buy a few heads of high-quality breeding stock. It made sense. Everyone knew her herd was strong and mine was in bad shape. It was a believable story, a natural cover. And from the moment I asked, I could see the hesitation behind her forced smile. She didn't want me anywhere near her operation. That alone told me plenty. She knew that anyone with even a basic understanding of ranching and water logistics would immediately notice the inconsistencies. But saying no outright would raise eyebrows. So after a brief pause, she reluctantly agreed to give me a tour. I told myself to keep the visit short and straightforward, but the moment I stepped onto Victoria's ranch, it felt like I had crossed into a different world, one where the crippling drought plaguing the rest of us simply didn't exist. The fields were so unnaturally green they could have been artificial. Water troughs glistened with crystal clear water that caught the sunlight like glass. Her herd of 500 Black Angus cattle looked more like show animals than livestock, coats gleaming, eyes sharp, bodies thriving. "You've got quite the setup here," I said as we walked past some of her top bulls. I kept my tone light and complimentary, careful not to let any of my suspicions slip through. "I'm especially curious about how you're managing water through all this. Everyone else is barely hanging on, and yet your cattle seem perfectly hydrated." That was the moment her mask cracked. Victoria's entire expression shifted and her cool confidence faltered, replaced by a flash of something I hadn't seen from her before: fear. "We've implemented highly efficient conservation systems," she stammered, her eyes suddenly darting around, avoiding mine. She toyed nervously with one of her flashy rings, the sort of fidget that screamed guilt to anyone paying close attention. "Advanced agricultural techniques approved by the state. Broken bar systems that, broken bar help maximize water efficiency." I nodded like I believed her, but then pushed just a little. "That's fascinating. As someone who's struggling badly, I'd really appreciate any advice. I'm sure other ranchers would, too. Maybe you could share those techniques with the community?" That's when she realized she'd stepped right into a trap. "What kind of systems, exactly?" I asked, acting like a desperate farmer looking for help, not an investigator closing in. "I mean, with the water issues I've been facing, any technical tips from someone as successful as you would be a game changer." She went pale. Then she literally took a step back, like I'd just accused her of something instead of asking for guidance. "This tour is over," she snapped. All the politeness evaporated. Her voice rose almost to a shout. "You're trespassing. I want you off this property immediately." Two ranch hands appeared almost instantly, like they'd been waiting nearby for a signal. They weren't there to work cattle, they were security, and they made sure I left the property without taking another step. But Victoria's angry outburst had told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just hiding something, she was terrified of it being exposed. That meant we were on the right track. Later that evening, Ruby came up with the idea that would change everything. "Uncle Marcus," she said, with a level of calm strategy that surprised me, "we need her to say it, on camera, like, actually admit out loud what she's doing." It was a brilliant idea, straight from the playbook of every crime documentary she'd ever watched, and it was exactly what we needed, undeniable proof. So we picked a spot for surveillance. About 200 yards from Victoria's ranch office, there was a grove of mesquite trees thick enough to keep us hidden but sparse enough to give us a clear view of her headquarters. Ruby brought her phone, which, surprisingly, had an impressive zoom lens. We waited quietly, knowing that every evening, like clockwork, Victoria walked the property, inspecting her elaborate water system and checking her infrastructure. The next morning, I made another important move. I called my old college roommate, Jake Patterson, now a lawyer who specialized in government corruption cases. Jake was always the sharp one. While I'd been focused on agriculture and growing the family ranch, he was deep into law books and constitutional theory. If anyone could help navigate what we were dealing with, it was him. When I showed him Ruby's footage, his reaction was immediate. "Marcus," he said, leaning back in his chair and raking his fingers through his graying hair, "this isn't just water theft. It's not even basic corruption anymore. This is textbook RICO, a racketeering, conspiracy, abuse of power, tax evasion, a broken bar. This case could land her behind bars for decades." But Jake also made sure I understood what we were up against. Victoria wasn't just some petty thief. She was a government insider with influence, connections, and likely access to funds and protection that went well beyond our small town. Going up against a corrupt official with access to taxpayer-funded legal firepower wasn't like a simple property line dispute between neighbors. This was David versus Goliath, and Goliath had a full team of government lawyers, deep political connections, and the power to make my life a living hell. Jake warned me that the legal battle ahead would be long and grueling. It could take 12 to 18 months just to move through the court system, and we'd be looking at over $25,000 in legal fees, expert witnesses, and court costs, money I didn't have. And even with the truth on our side, there was still the danger of evidence mysteriously vanishing or witnesses suddenly changing their stories under pressure from Victoria's powerful network. "Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this?" Jake asked, "because once we move forward, there's no walking it back. She'll come after you with everything she's got." I thought of my father and the promise I made at his grave. I thought of the land that had been in our family for generations. I thought about my 50 head of cattle growing weaker by the day, while Victoria's 500 thrived off stolen water. 25 grand is more than I earn in a year, I told Jake, but Sarah and I talked it through. My dad wouldn't have hesitated to risk everything to stand up to this kind of corruption, and we're willing to do the same. So Jake filed multiple complaints with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, the State Water Board, the county prosecutor, and the state attorney general. Within 48 hours, a full-blown federal investigation was underway, and Victoria got wind of it fast. Her retaliation was swift, ruthless and completely expected. Suddenly, I became the target of a relentless barrage of fines and citations from agencies I hadn't even known existed. The housing authority came at me first, claiming my fence height violated some obscure agricultural code. That cost me $750. Then they hit me with a $1,200 fine for my compost pile at the same one that had been in place for 15 years, now suddenly labeled an unlicensed manure storage facility. When my roosters crowed at sunrise, as they always had, I was fined $400 for violating rural noise ordinances. And when I repaired my old barn roof, something I'd done dozens of times since I was a teenager, they slapped me with a $900 fine for unpermitted livestock shelter modification. But Victoria didn't stop with the housing authority. She reached out to her contacts in other departments, turning my everyday life into a bureaucratic war zone designed to crush me financially before the legal process could even begin. A health inspector arrived without warning, allegedly responding to an anonymous tip about food safety issues in our home. He spent hours rummaging through our kitchen, pantry, and fridge. When he found nothing, he turned his attention to Ruby, asking her uncomfortable, prying questions and making thinly veiled threats about child protective services if her living conditions didn't improve. The next week, the fire marshal showed up and cited us for hay storage violations in the barn where we had stored hay safely for decades. Then came a building inspector who claimed our barn had structural issues, even though it had stood firm through floods, droughts, and storms for over 50 years. But the most infuriating blow came from the county tax assessor, who suddenly re-evaluated our land, claiming its value had doubled overnight. Just like that, our annual property taxes skyrocketed. There was no rhyme or reason, just bureaucratic justification invented to break us. In less than 2 weeks, Victoria had buried us under over $5,000 in fines, penalties, and tax hikes. All on paper, all technically legal, but every bit of it was clearly orchestrated. A warning: drop the case or the system will crush you. Thank God for Ruby. She recorded every single harassment incident on video. That footage would later prove critical in revealing the pattern of targeted retaliation. But the toll on our family was severe. Sarah began having panic attacks every time an unfamiliar vehicle pulled into our driveway, terrified of which agency was coming next. I was barely sleeping, losing weight, and for the first time in my life, I started to lose faith in a system I had believed was meant to protect honest people. She's showing us exactly why people lose trust in government, I told Jake on one of our many late-night calls. I just don't know how much more of this we can take. Meanwhile, Jake was working tirelessly behind the scenes to build the case that would bring Victoria down for good. He pulled together a team of expert witnesses, including a hydraulic engineer who could break down the specifics of her water theft operation, and a former state employee who'd been pushed out for refusing to participate in similar corruption. As the investigation deepened, the full extent of Victoria's 6-year scheme began to unfold, and it was even worse than we imagined. The forensic hydraulic engineer determined she had stolen over 4.5 million gallons of municipal water, valued at roughly $1.8 million at current drought rates. The FBI's financial team uncovered that her illegal cattle operation had been raking in over $300,000 in untaxed profits annually. Thanks to that stolen water, she hadn't declared a single cent of it. That opened the door for the IRS, who discovered she'd been running a full-scale agricultural business while officially reporting only her modest government salary. That meant federal tax evasion was now added to her growing rap sheet. The media caught wind quickly. Local news ran the headline, "Housing Authority Director Accused of Multi-million-dollar Water Theft." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Small farmers were furious, many of them having been denied well permits by Victoria over the years. Wealthier ranchers who had benefited from her favoritism scrambled to defend her, but it was too late. On social media, the story went viral. The #corruptVictoria trended nationally, fueled by Ruby's videos, which struck a chord with people far beyond our rural county. The story wasn't just about water anymore, it was about power, greed, and justice. As the pressure mounted, Victoria grew desperate. One after the evidence was so overwhelming that even Victoria's elite legal team, bankrolled by public funds, had no viable defense. Judge Harper's ruling was scathing and historic. From the bench, she declared, "This case reflects the most egregious abuse of government authority I've seen in 3 decades. The defendant stole life-sustaining resources from drought-stricken citizens while enriching herself through an elaborate criminal enterprise. The consequences matched the crime." Victoria was sentenced to 36 months in federal prison, a real time, not the symbolic suspended sentence white-collar criminals often receive. She was also ordered to pay $500,000 in restitution and fines, lost her government pension, and was permanently barred from public service of any kind. The housing authority she led was disbanded and replaced with a citizen oversight board, elected directly by the community. As for me, I was awarded $125,000 in damages, and the federal government covered all our legal expenses. But that wasn't the real victory. The most important part of Judge Harper's decision was the emergency injunction. All illegal government water operations must be terminated within 30 days. Victoria's empire of stolen water, her underground pipelines, her off-the-books delivery system, her elaborate irrigation network had to be dismantled entirely. No more free-flowing municipal water for her 500 head of cattle. No more emerald pastures in the middle of a drought. No more luxurious fountains or swimming pools, while the rest of us hauled buckets to keep our animals alive. After decades of service and 6 years of orchestrated theft, Victoria Thornfield was finally being forced to live under the same conditions as everyone else. Day 30 came like Christmas for the community. Federal marshals arrived at Victoria's ranch, armed with cutting tools and sealing equipment. Ruby and I watched from our property line as they severed the main water pipelines and sealed the valves to her illegal network. The last municipal water truck was turned away at the gate. The driver, realizing his side hustle had come to an end, shook his head and drove off. Victoria's 500 pampered cattle animals that had never known thirst were about to find out what it meant to live in the real world, the same harsh world the rest of us had endured all along. We had lived under the weight of that drought for 3 brutal years, but the moment Victoria's water supply was cut off, the impact on her operation was instant. Day 1, her cattle, spoiled and overindulged from years of automated water systems, became visibly unsettled. Deprived for the first time of their unlimited supply, they wandered aimlessly across the emerald fields that were rapidly turning dull, their agitation growing by the hour. These animals had never known thirst, and their confusion was as sad as it was ironic. Ruby, now a minor celebrity for her role in bringing down the operation, has started documenting what she cheekily called government cattle chaos. Her footage was equal parts hilarious and heartbreaking. Purebred Black Angus cattle, bred for luxury, now bewildered by the absence of something as basic as water. Day 2. Panic spread across Victoria's ranch. The herd crowded around a handful of legal troughs tied to the municipal supply of water she now had to pay for at full drought prices. It wasn't nearly enough. Watching those animals scramble for access felt like watching the tables turn in real time. These were the elite cattle of our region, pampered while our own livestock suffered. But now, they were living our reality, fighting for every drop. By day 3, the desperation was undeniable. Ruby's videos captured scenes that would have been unthinkable a week before: prize-winning cattle licking dew off metal gates, pawing at dry earth, running from one empty trough to another in growing panic. Her footage spread like wildfire online. Within days, #government cattle chaos hit over 100 million views across platforms. People everywhere were captivated to commenting, sharing, and finding poetic justice in the downfall of a woman who had abused her position for years. Government corruption getting exactly what it deserves, wrote one user. Don't steal water if you can't handle the thirst, quipped another. By day 6, the call I never expected came. Victoria phoned from federal prison. Her voice was thin, cracking, barely holding it together over the noise of other inmates in the background. "Marcus," she said, her tone full of panic, "please see, I'll give you everything. The ranch, the cattle, whatever you want. Just help them. They're suffering, and it's not their fault." And for a second, I almost felt sorry for her, almost, but then I thought about my own livestock, about the dry creek beds and the heat, and the nights I'd spent praying for rain while her herd drank from stolen municipal lines. I was sitting beside the new well I'd finally been allowed to dig, a clear, legal, and flowing strangle when I answered her. "Victoria," I said quietly, "you denied my well permit while your cattle drank stolen water every day. You used your title to rob honest people and cloak it in environmental righteousness. Now, your herd gets what the law allows and nothing more." The irony was bitter and undeniable. Her cattle were finally experiencing the reality she'd inflicted on every rancher for years. Ruby's footage transformed what started as a rural scandal into a global moment. Journalists from across the country and even overseas showed up to interview the farmer who fought City Hall and won. My simple line to a reporter became one of the most shared quotes of the year. "I just wanted to dig one well on my father's land while a government official was stealing water for 500 cattle. It resonated because it was simple and honest, something rare in a world that had watched too many people in power get away with too much. The internet lit up with memes. Victoria's mugshot was plastered next to photos of confused cattle with captions like, "Don't let government steal your water. What goes around comes around." Congressional committees invited me to testify on public corruption. Activist groups called our case a landmark victory for government accountability. Documentary crews offered exclusive rights to our story. And for the first time, our little county wasn't just a forgotten patch of farmland, it was the epicenter of a national reckoning. But the price of justice was steep. Victoria's empire collapsed with the same speed it had risen. She was forced to sell all 500 of her cattle in a frantic emergency auction of buyers, knowing full well she had no leverage, and her livestock were declining fast. The federal government seized her ranch to repay restitution to the farmers she'd harmed. One by one, her allies abandoned her, scrambling to save their own reputations as the extent of her corruption was exposed. She became radioactive, untouchable, a warning to others. Some of the wealthier ranchers, those who had benefited from Victoria's favoritism, tried to frame me as an enemy of public service, painting my actions as an attack on government itself. But the facts were too damning, and public support was far too strong for their narrative to gain any traction. The threats began almost immediately after the sentencing. Late-night anonymous phone calls warned me that government employees have long memories and that accidents happen to people who stir up trouble. Someone slashed my truck tire twice. Sarah found threatening notes tucked under her windshield wipers while out grocery shopping. For the first few months after Victoria's conviction, federal marshals provided security for our family. It was surreal, a reminder of how dangerous this fight had been all along. But instead of scaring us into silence, the intimidation only strengthened our resolve. It confirmed what we already knew. Standing up had been the right thing to do. Meanwhile, our victory began creating real, tangible change across the region. 23 other farmers came forward with stories that mirrored mine. They'd also been denied legal well permits while Victoria ran her criminal water operation behind closed doors. With part of the settlement money, I launched the Anti-Corruption Legal Fund, hiring Jake to serve as its lead attorney. It offered free legal help to rural families who had faced government abuse but lacked the resources to fight back. In its first year, the fund successfully challenged corrupt practices in 4 different counties. Another portion of the settlement went to building a community well system, a clean, reliable water shared by 15 neighboring farms that had suffered under Victoria's manipulation. It wasn't just about water, it was about rebuilding trust, about restoring what government should have protected all along. The newly reformed housing authority, now made up of elected local citizens, not political appointees, stepped up as well. They provided emergency water access to Victoria's remaining cattle through legal and transparent processes. It was a small but powerful gesture, a reflection of a cooperative spirit that her corruption had eroded. But the most unexpected moment came 6 months after her sentencing. Victoria wrote me a letter from federal prison. "Marcus," it began, "I want you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. I abused my government position for personal greed and betrayed the public trust. I don't expect forgiveness, but seeing the news coverage of your community well project has shown me what real public service looks like." It was probably the most honest thing she'd ever said. And though it didn't undo the damage or erase the months of fear and harassment we endured, it was a small form of accountability, a rare and meaningful in cases of government corruption. Ruby, ever the documentarian, turned the final chapter into one of her most powerful videos, Government Accountability and a Fresh Start. In it, she showcased the new well system, interviewed grateful farmers, and captured the quiet triumph of a community that had reclaimed its dignity. The video went viral, racking up millions of views and thousands of comments from people who, perhaps for the first time, believed that ordinary citizens could still bring down powerful corrupt officials. The ripple effect was real. Government agencies across the state began introducing new transparency requirements and citizen oversight boards inspired by our case. But our fight uncovered even more than just Victoria's water theft. What we found about her network of corruption across other counties, well, that's another story altogether, and it's even more shocking than the cattle operation. Comment below what you think we might have uncovered next, and subscribe, because this saga of government accountability, it's far from over. Another day, another outrageous story. This is DD Stories, and justice, it's just getting started.